as to what I do think is an important issue in the sector where you all practice. And I'm going to say some perhaps blunt things, particularly about the way I see the existing relationship between academic anthropology and the applied work. I've got the term engine room there, asking the question, is academic context and training currently an engine room in the sense of driving the preparation for people to work in the sector, or are we confronting a degree of disinterest that we should engage with? And I should say, I don't mean this as entirely negative. I want to finish on a positive note because ultimately I want to encourage greater collaborative discussion between the discipline in the academy and in the applied arena. I think it's an important question. It's not in any way, I feel, to be a superficial contest which sometimes arises, where we'll have discomfort either from academic teachers and researchers on the one hand about what happens in applied anthropology in the sector that we're dealing with here, or the other way around. There's lots of criticism about academics in ivory towers who lack engagement with this important sector of work in Australian society. Partnerships and collaborations are few and far between, I feel. And the question is, why then is it so difficult to achieve and have more relevant courses across the universities in Australia, and actually people come from overseas as well? There are similar lackings of knowledge to work in the sector from such people there. And I believe this is an issue for the future of where everybody works. Well, I'm presenting my own view that there is a tremendous potential value of academic energy and engine room that could be much better integrated with the applied work. And intellectual contributions is clearly important, with a few example issues there in brackets, which are obvious to everyone in the room, but we are dealing with our profession that presents opinions and researches necessarily in legal contexts and other negotiation contexts, questions of cultural connection with country, continuities and changes. Compensation is a particularly emergent issue where intellectual clarity about how to approach that matter is so important. These are all complex topics which in the academy we would hope would engage with them and provide tools for applied work in the sector. And then there's the public standing as well of the discipline across different parties. Obviously, this is as to how anthropology is perceived and understood among Indigenous corporations, groups, NTRVs, whatever, individuals, and in government and in industry as well. A very important party, in my view, or in the work that's done. Yes. And of course, in any legal matters or roughly legal matters, this question at the end there is, well, what's professional opinion among anthropologists informed by? Is it reliable? And is it reliable social science? Um, there's lots of academic discussion about how scientific sociocultural anthropology might be. It's heavily interpretive. Subjectivity is involved, of course. But ultimately, in the world where we work, if I want to be successful in having my opinions taken seriously in legal contexts, I will make the case that they are informed by social science. And social science is done in the universities to train our colleagues. There are legal expectations, and the question of wherein lies the expertise of anthropologists working in the sector is at the heart of this. Um, Just a note on the first dot point there, we don't, I think, have in any of the universities much collaboration in teaching or research between the law schools and the anthropology majors. And yet, everybody here knows that we operate as applied anthropologists, and it is absolutely essential that we understand the legal context in which this work is done. There are a lot of reasons for the lack of collaboration between law schools and anthropology teaching, and a lot of it is to do with the usual resources and turf wars and how many courses can you fit into a lawyer's training. And if you let anthropologists come in, you're losing some courses that otherwise need to be taught in straightforward law and so on. In the humanities and social sciences in the universities, the question arises of, in fact, whether it's self-defeating to ignore employment outcomes. There's so much talk in universities these days about engaging with vocational-oriented teaching. There's the question of what attracts students to the discipline and what attracts all of us. There's the matter of the long tradition in anthropology of advocacy as, for many, a fundamental aspect of why people come into the discipline in the first place. And yet we have, obviously in our universities as well, especially as they get past the first couple of undergraduate years, people thinking about their careers and their salary options and where they're going. And the bottom dot point there, which is not news to everybody, but there's the tension in the discipline between intellectual critique on the one hand to do with the history of colonialism and the connection historically between settled colonialism and the discipline, and tensions about how much compromise away from critique towards outcomes that our academic colleagues are prepared to take on. In other words, we've got lots of critique, but let's park it in order to train people to actually go out in the world and do something. So what are the big questions? What are the national trends? Well, yes. How is applied anthropology and Indigenous studies regarded in the universities? We need to be thinking in a fairly clear and blunt way about this, I think. What's the current academic view about native title, land management, cultural heritage work, and the host of related matters that people go to work on? And how do we compare that academic view or views with the actual work tasks in the sector? Is there a realistic knowledge in the university anthropology teaching about what people do when they go to jobs in this sector we're speaking about? I'll say something about that shortly. And it's interesting that the last 10, 20, 30 years in global anthropology, people have moved between these terms applied, engaged, and advocacy. And trying to position the discipline as, wait, is it applied? Because applied implies too much of a application in a practical way to work. Maybe it's better to talk about engaged anthropology, where there's less of a getting your hands dirty on actual cases, but rather engaging with the world. And then there's this whole question of advocacy, and can you do advocacy when you've got your hands dirty? Yeah. So what's in this academic engine room? The issues are, well, what interest is there for practitioners to actually participate in legal cases? And what is the attitude to the compromises that are necessarily required? I mean, it's stating the obvious, but if people want to stand up and say, well, wait, we're not going to teach native title anthropology because what that's about is, Indigenous people having to subject themselves to a white court or a white fellow court, and uh, and that's too much of a compromise. Well, yes, of course it is. There's no obviously we're talking about Australia as it is, and there are compromises required. Compromises in claims for rights on matters of compensation. There are negotiations. Every time there's a cultural heritage survey, it's a negotiation between parties with an expectation of working towards agreement. So the discipline has to engage with the existence of contesting parties. We're not solely engaged in work that can address the issues from Indigenous parties. It's in the context of broader negotiations. I can say more about that later. I think in the academic engine room, there is a desired distance from this idea of complicity with settler colonialism, as I said, matters of what is ethical, who's on the right side of history and who isn't. And at the bottom there, yes, fears of presenting expert evidence, because you've got to talk about facts and opinions and truths. And is all of that too positivist in the sense of, philosophical traditions of the social sciences? And when we look at, this is just one tiny, advertisement that I picked up on because it's one of the latest that came to me about a job advertised in the Northern Territory, the Sacred Sites Authority. And so these tasks are positivist in some ways, but they involve, in my submission, as we say in the courts, all of those dot points involve and entail the need for sophisticated intellectual approach, and that to position them as too positivist and solely committed in some naive way to establishing facts is illegitimate. Now, in the universities, for those of us who've been there for quite a while now, this is a heavily political issue. It's not just about the teaching of anthropology; it's about all disciplines, in fact, in the universities now, with with what is, in my view, an ambiguous idea of decolonizing the disciplines. Well, what would that mean? There's lots of identity politics and turf wars over who should be doing what. There's gatekeeping. How do issues, in the US, Canada, and other countries, the idea of Indigenous science grew over the last few decades. Well, if we've got Indigenous science and knowledge is plural, and if there's to be nothing about us without us, as one of the phrasings can be pushed around in these debates in the universities, how does this compare to social science analysis? Social science, including anthropology, by and large, doesn't embrace the proposition in general areas of research. Let's say researching farmers in Australia or religious communities in cities or whoever. Our social science colleagues study all over the place, and there is no expectation that there will be a final unanimity of agreement with the conclusions that the social scientist comes up with. What I'm trying to point out here is that the politics of asserting important resolutions out of the history of settler colonialism have to engage as well with the methodologies and theoretical approaches of the social sciences, which involve research subjects, certainly, being collaborative in projects, but without any suggestion that a final without any suggestion that the conclusions and the opinions of the anthropologist or the sociologist or the historian or whatever will necessarily be agreed with by all of those in the researched communities. If you're with me, these are some of the politics that we're dealing with. Decolonizing the disciplines, where do we take that? Is this a gesture or something of substance? Well, in the universities, in the humanities and the social sciences generally, and in anthropology, there's a degree of discomfort about this idea of authoritative disciplinary expertise. Who is an expert? Well, so if we give a seminar in academic anthropology, it's unlikely there'll be discomfort about the anthropologist being presented as an expert, or at least that expertise would be regarded as in some tension with local level knowledge, whoever the research community might be, but particularly in the context of Indigenous studies. But in the legal context, of course, that's why you're employed. You're experts. We're experts. That's the language of the law. We can only give opinion evidence in our reports on the basis of our training with a degree of expertise. So there's a real tension here. There's a understandable privileging of the idea of Indigenous knowledge, but what's not spoken about sufficiently openly is, well, who's got it? Who can get it? Who can't get it? How do you get it? Is it solely a matter of a bloodline? Is it solely a matter of descent? Yet social scientists know that cultural knowledge in any population of the world comes from socialization in a particular setting, not from a bloodline, though descent will factor into people's cultural knowledge. The bottom dot point's interesting, some very controversial issues. Tim Rouse recently edited a book with some colleagues on the difference identity makes and this idea of Indigenous cultural capital, which is very dominant now in the arts performance area. So it's a matter of your identity, asserted identity as to whether you hold this cultural capital. So what does the anthropologist have in relation to capital? What capital does the expert social scientist bring? It's not Indigenous cultural capital, but it's some form of expertise. And what I think is a ridiculous proposition, which is called citational justice, which some of you may not know about, but it's asking social scientists to regulate who they cite on the basis of the personal identities of the authors. This is global. So not whether the social science research articles fit impressively with the work of the writer, but rather, are they black or white in America? Are they this or that? So it's an ownership. It's an intention to regulate the quality of social science on the basis of personal identity rather than the adequacy of the studies. Well, what have we got? Courses in the universities. Well, Lee sort of mentioned this just very briefly. Not so much speaking of archaeology here. There's more archaeology teaching about heritage than there is a cultural heritage, and there is probably anthropology. What have we got with courses on native title? Well, Trinity Hamsey, our colleague from Goldfields in 2014, did a bit of a look. There are very few explicitly on the subject. You're going to find it hard in any Australian university to find a course on native title anthropology. And I mean by that something like we had at UWA. I'm not in any way self-promoting here, but between 2005 and 2012, I think there was an example where there was a graduate course. It required a major in from a Bachelor of Science or a Bachelor of Arts in anthropology, full-time or part-time, fee-paying. And the courses in that second bottom dot point there were quite explicitly native title anthropology, cultural heritage, legal aspects and methods. So actual engagement with the literature that we have arising out of case materials. It was cancelled by Dean sometime after I left UWA and came here to UQ. Why? Well, I'll talk about that in a sec. But that was even though there were funds for that teaching from both the state and Commonwealth governments at the time and from Rio Tinto. And that's another issue. Universities absolutely, of course, are concerned about budgets. And in my view, we need to take a mature approach to the receipt of industry funds where they're available to assist in generating courses to train anthropologists, subject, of course, to the usual regulations that apply to all industry funds that go into universities. I mean, UQ's got a Sustainable Minerals Institute, which receives huge money from the mining company majors across the country, and they integrate that into their teaching. Happy to sort of debate that as we go along. Well, why was that course cancelled? Yep, financial issues was talked about. Was it popular enough among students? Was it sustainable in the sense that you fee-paying courses at immediate postgraduate level are fee-paying, and if you satiate the market, if you spend the first 3 years having good take-up, but then there are no more any people enrolling, the deans and the universities are very worried about that. So that's why I think it is such a niche and specialist sector that we do need external funding into the universities. If you're not going to get it from government, then you try with the private sector. Is it ethical? Is it sufficiently collaborative? What about the question of joint authorship with Aboriginal people? A huge issue in academic research at the moment and for some academic journals across the globe, depending on the subjects of submitted articles. But joint authorship doesn't fit well with expertise in legal context in authoring a report. I mean, I'm not sure what everybody's experiences are, but conflicts of interest issues can arise if you're asking an anthropologist, an in-house practitioner or a consultant or anybody else to give professional opinions. Well, those opinions clearly can be written up as based on collaborative relationships with the people with whom you're conducting interviews and mapping country and so on. But if they are interested parties in the outcome, it's not clear to me that I would be able to author an expert's report jointly with even, say, half a dozen senior people who might have mostly worked for me. The whole matter is conflated with this idea of ownership of cultural knowledge, which we need to separate professional expertise from who owns the knowledge. There's enormous political pressures on university executives. I shouldn't probably say this, but I will. A lot of them don't know what they're doing, in the sense, and they will acknowledge this. It is so hard. They are subject to such political pressures about how does a university best recognise and acknowledge and be on the right side of history and assist Indigenous interests. And they're subject to what can be at times not terribly well-grounded propositions. such as indigenizing the curricula, integrating the cultural knowledge, the Indigenous knowledge that undergraduate students who are Indigenous bring into the university, into the curricula. Well, as I've said yesterday to somebody at the University of Queensland, those students may have no Indigenous knowledge. They have an identity. It depends on their background. It depends where they grew up. It depends on their socialization. So let's try and have some proper, blunt discussion about this. That's not saying anything against these students, of course, but the debates can be very naive. I'll try and bring this towards some concluding comments shortly. But all of this, the problem is that disciplinary competence and its status is undermined. Wherein lies the expertise then in a decolonized applied anthropology? Can anthropology, research, applied, academic or otherwise, be reduced to what Indigenous colleagues said to me many years ago, more than 2 decades ago? Well, anthropology is good. It's out there. It's joining the dots. It's penciling in the elders' knowledge. Actually, no, it's not, which I think talked about at the time. If it's penciling in, if it's joining the dots like a kid's drawing, we lose the whole question of professional opinion and analysis. And I put in that bottom dot point there, the obvious concepts that require major expertise and across some difficult but really important topics that everybody encounters in our work. And I have in mind there, obviously, the questions of cultural continuities and changes, contestation between different parties, including between different Indigenous parties, which is extremely difficult for applied anthropologists to work with. The issue of strategic traditionalism in evaluating the cultural significance issues that emerge in surveys in native title, the whole monetization of culture, potentially or actually, which everybody surely knows about. Where to? Well, it should be obvious. I think there's a need for more explicit debate. I want to encourage us all to write back, to respond to rebut simplistic critiques of anthropology, to address the professional work tasks and for us to make them more understood and well known, and to forge important alliances with those academic colleagues into the future who do have commitment to academic and applied collaborations. Thank you very much.
Yes, so we actually finishing a little bit early. Does anyone want to ask any questions to us?
Wait for the. Sorry, can I just ask you? My name is Paul Dotton. Coming from those lovely states that you've mentioned a few times in your presentation, but one of the things that I've noticed is that, certainly in the United States, trying to establish the authority, and I'm really using that term, not just expertise, the authority of anthropological analysis and expertise and opinion outside of the courtroom is almost a non-starter. When I read back in the old Franz Boas and some of these other people, Ruth Benedict, those other people in the United States, and you look at how they had advocacy aspects to their work when they spoke against racism or phrenology and all this kind of foolishness, right? There is at least a sense that this very learned individual from this learned institution had an opinion that was contrary to what was common sense, but still should be listened to. So Boas is saying something. or Margaret Mead is debating James Baldwin, right? There's some sense of that these are people who know something, that are not just reading a bunch of novels. That's important, but James Baldwin isn't just reading novels, he's writing them. Yeah. Margaret Mead is not just looking at cultures abroad, like how you're visiting, but actually she's analyzing something. The point I'm making is this, is that the outside of the courtroom situation, in the past, there was at least this jostling where anthropological expertise from people who were trained, had their doctorates, or went to prestigious universities, actually were at least semi-heard in the press. Fast forward to now, you get that connect the dot foolishness, which is going on. And even the response of saying, hey, this is what we should be thinking about more critically about this cultural phenomenon, this social phenomenon, this political phenomenon. It's sort of like, well, that's just your opinion. So anthropology becomes just like this opinion, often a progressive opinion, right? And if that's the way it is within the non-legal sphere, I cannot imagine how terrible it must be within the legal sphere to establish one's credibility. That in front of a judge or the lawyers, people not saying, well, I can figure this out myself. I mean, it's just sort of common sense, right? So I think that there's this deeper question, and I want you, please, because you touched on many of these points here, how do we position ourselves that what we are saying is actually meritorious, is actually expertise in the first place? And then the question of how you would apply that within legal context and not look as just being a progressive advocate of X, Y, and Z. So there you go.
Yeah, thanks. Well, some big issues there. I would say just one point is that in the legal context, especially in the actual courtroom, where you're giving expert testimony, which not everybody does in the sector, at least in Australia, there's greater recognition among the judiciary and the judges and a lot of lawyers as well about the authority of the anthropological opinions, much more so than outside in the media and in the wider society. This may be something different from the US now, I don't know. But I mean, the last 3-4 decades in Australia, we've had a lot of anthropologists and their evidence, their expert evidence, taken really seriously by judges and ultimately by lawyers, although we've had the odd judge and cross-examining lawyers who say exactly as you mentioned, well, Your Honour, these matters that this anthropologist is talking about, they're just common sense. You and I, we know just as much about these subjects as and challenging the authority and the disciplinary training and so on. Although then other lawyers will defend against that proposition. And I think it's rarely been a very successful cross-examination strategy in Australian courts involving anthropologists. But the bigger issue, or the other issue, absolutely, I agree. I mean, it's part of what I'm trying to suggest here, that the only way the authority of the discipline, if you like, and the expertise can be better addressed and reinforced outside of the legal context is for more robust presentation of why should somebody in the media publish an article by an anthropologist about wherever they've worked in the world or wherever. It's I guess we've got in the social sciences and the humanities for some time now, with the rise of postmodernism over several decades, and all of this, the challenging of whether researchers are in part writing not quite fiction, but they're writing partial truths, not full truths, and all of this stuff. So we've got the hugeness of that intellectual debate that's been going on globally. I would like to see a more robust establishment of the expertise, and I agree, than we currently have. And I want us to talk back.
Yeah. I'm shocked. Just being bigger than the nutshell is this. what about because this is new for me, when I come here to Australia and I see the archaeologists, it seems that they have less of this problem because that's what they want is scientific, right? And I've actually had anthropologists who are very supportive of me kind of make that distinction. And I said, geez, I guess if you call me archaeologist, they may listen to you more than the outside than if you're an anthropologist. So,
well, I think that's an important point, and certainly, most of our archaeology colleagues, they're able to work with data, statistical and otherwise, and that gets us to this question of the empirical basis that informs conclusions in anthropology. If we just park the idea of opinions for the minute, and this is something which is probably important, that we have to make the case that there are data. We're not just making it up. However, one of the small qualification is that we hope all of our colleagues don't make it up, and sometimes, especially if we might have an anthropologist for whom advocacy for a particular cause is paramount, rather than establishing independent expertise, that's not good. And often it comes unstuck. And I'm sure most people in the room would agree it's actually counterproductive for the client or for the people whose interests that advocating anthropologist is trying to address. But thank you very much for the comments.
Greg, Corey, thanks very much. And I think
There's a really good.
Hello, everyone. I just wanted to say that we need to think about all of this stuff in a broader sense of how is science seen in a broader system in the courts and otherwise, because we're all assuming, that science is somehow indestructible. We're not starting from the view that, many scientists make up data in courts. Science is constantly proved wrong, but we are always kind of somehow comparing ourselves to science as if it's some kind of absolute truth. And I would really like to see us lift ourselves a little bit and consider just sort of start promoting that idea in some ways, rather than always being on the back foot about, oh, you're not proper scientists.
That's just one quick thought on that. Making that point, whether it's in legal context or others, might shoot yourself in the foot. So the expert or the anthropologist writes a report on the basis that, yes, it's social science, so it's subject to what we know all the differences are, and it's full of caveats and qualifications at times. But if, I suppose to put it most harshly, there's possibly no room in the sector for, if there's too much philosophizing about, well, I'm going to say that these are my conclusions, but in fact, they might be wrong. And that's because our inquiries are subject to the vagaries of this, that, and the other and everything. I mean, I agree with you, Tony, intellectually, but it's just the practicalities of being an effective practitioner in the field requires a cautious approach to that, I'd say.
But as long as, and what you're saying is kind of the fundamental problem, that the way everything is seen in the court situation is kind of oppressive and doesn't allow change. All these kind of, I'm not saying that everyone turns around and starts writing their course or making these kind of qualifications. I'm not saying that at all. I'm saying there's a broader discourse, systemic discourse, that needs to be cultivated, and that in some ways there's a need for us to push back a bit. in the sense of not always sitting, oh, well, that's sort of
Sure.
is the long term thing on board.
Yeah. This.
We've got one more. You've got time for one more, and that's it, I'm afraid.
Thanks, David, for a very challenging and interesting, brave presentation. Just wanted to clarify something that you and Lee have touched on, which is, is it correct that the only universities in Australia still teaching anthropology of Aboriginal Australia are UQ and ANU? Is that the current situation?
Probably not. I think there will be courses here and there. My thinking here was particularly not so much about courses on Indigenous Australia generally, but rather on the applied side of things and the sector here. There are other courses, of course, in other disciplines of history and Indigenous studies and so on, but yeah, I don't know that they embrace an anthropological perspective. So it's a hard thing to get a handle on. We should do a more thorough survey, but I think we do know that even where, like at La Trobe, for example, I could think of a colleague who teaches a course on Indigenous Australia somehow, but not addressing applied work outside, teaching people to write articles for academic journals or to engage with native title and cultural heritage. So